So good to have you join us today. Hello and welcome to Business Daily. I'm Lee-Jiun in Seoul. Let's get started with a look at today's highlights. China unleashes a series of retaliatory actions against Korea, including the closure of retail giant Lotte stores, posing a rising threat to Korean firms. Spain's economy continues to pick up amid a recovery in consumer confidence and rising exports. So we take a look at what lessons Korea may be able to take away from Spain to return to solid growth. These stories and more coming right up. Seoul and Washington have begun the deployment of the missile defense system THAAD here in South Korea on Tuesday, just a day after North Korea test-fired 4 ballistic missiles. And this comes despite Beijing's strong objection to the decision and its fear to further hurt Korean firms doing business with China. For more, we connect to our Lee Joo-young on the phone. So Joo-young, a growing number of Korean companies are facing more difficulties.
Yes, June. On top of over 3 dozen Lotte marts being forced to shut down temporarily as of Tuesday, Korea's food and cosmetics manufacturers are bearing the brunt of China's retaliatory measures. A lot of this is coming in the form of stricter sanitation tests and stronger quarantine measures, resulting in delayed customs clearance. For cosmetics companies, some are finding that it's taking much longer than the standard time required to pass China's sanitary inspections, and others are being denied altogether.
So is anything being done to help these firms?
Korea's trade ministry has said it will offer an emergency loan of up to roughly $870,000 for as long as 5 years to small and mid-sized firms exposed to financial risks stemming from China's retaliatory actions. Korea is also considering filing a complaint with the World Trade Organization to actively look into whether China's actions violate a bilateral free trade pact while looking to minimize damages on Korean industries. This has been Lee Joo-young for Business Daily.
Is Korea seeing the start of China's unofficial economic sanctions over Seoul's decision to deploy the U.S. missile defense system THAAD? On Monday, Korea's Lotte Group said Chinese authorities have shut down nearly 2 dozen of its retail stores after inspections, and there have been reports of Lotte websites becoming the targets of cyber attacks originating from China. And experts say that Beijing is ramping up pressure on Lotte because the company agreed to cooperate with that deployment. Not only that, Korea's tourism industry is at risk, with China looking to discourage visits to Korea by banning the sale of tour packages sold by travel agencies. So with such moves expected to continue for the time being, what can Korea do to protect its economy? Take a look.
China is unhappy with Korea, and it's not afraid to show it. Korea's Lotte Group has become China's latest target after it concluded a land swap deal, providing the site of deployment for the U.S. missile defense system THAAD. The sudden closure of its retail stores in China and hack attacks on Lotte websites have ignited fears of greater losses. China's tourism ministry has instructed travel agencies in Beijing to stop selling tour packages to Korea from March. Korea's been greatly benefiting from the rising number of Chinese tourists, with more than 8 million visiting the country last year. So with a dark cloud looming over Seoul-Beijing ties, there are growing concerns that the Korean economy could be hit even harder by acts of retaliation from China.
And to tell us more about this, Professor Yang Jun-suk from the Catholic University of Korea joins us in the studio today. So good to see you.
Happy to be here.
So if this tension between Korea and China continues, then what impact will it have on Korean businesses, including its tourism industry as well as duty-free stores?
Okay, well, some stores, some establishments are definitely going to be affected very badly. Lotte is a good example. But so far, we're not clear about the numbers that will affect Korea nationally. Now, if you look at the goods that has been affected so far, cosmetics, that's 1% of Korea's exports to China. If you look at music, exports of music, CDs and files, it's only about $53 million.
Okay.
So just in terms of the numbers, it's not very large so far. Also, things like duty-free shops, tourism, it'll definitely have an effect. But so far, people are reporting that there's some Chinese tourists who are reluctant to buy, but that's mostly anecdotal. We haven't seen that big a fall off of numbers. And even though this will be very difficult for the establishment, the firms involved, duty-free shops have been in trouble since the mismanaged license processing in 2015. And the for the group tour industry, people were complaining just last year that most of the profits go to Chinese companies, not Korean.
Okay.
So we haven't seen what the numbers are yet. But so far, I think the Chinese are targeting their targets very well because it's causing a lot of news.
But then at this point, we're wondering, how would this economic retaliation also affect the Chinese economy?
Well, China is definitely a bigger economy than Korea. So they have more room to sort of put damage to Korea. But Korea can also do a lot of damage as well if this battle escalates. Korea is China's fourth largest export target. So it exports about 4.3% or $87 billion worth of goods to Korea. China does. Most of all, of Korean exports of goods, about 78% are intermediate goods. And a lot of that, perhaps about half, goes to exports, Chinese exports. And some of these items are not easily available elsewhere. So if this escalates, then Korea does have capacity to wound China, but in the net, Korea will probably come off worse.
In your opinion, were there any ways that Korea could have prepared for such retaliatory actions from China?
I think it would have been very difficult. We've seen before that if the government insists that NGOs are involved, so government is not formally involved, then there's not really that much that governments, especially foreign governments, can do about these supposed activities of NGOs. So I don't think it would have had a much effect. But as I mentioned before, so far these activities seem to be targeted to cause a lot of publicity, but perhaps not a lot of real damage.
Now, did China's retaliatory actions violate the international law by any way?
Okay, well, so far they can argue that it doesn't. For example, they've been using health standards for cosmetics, and that's allowed under WTO agreements. Korea has a very strict SPS regulations of its own for food imports. Cultural imports also lie somewhat outside the WTO agreements because, well, French, Korean, China, they feared so-called cultural invasion from other countries. And then for things like what Lotte is going through, the minor regulations that shuts down individual stores, well, you have to prove that it was done discriminately. So it was only targeted at Lotte. And that can be somewhat difficult.
Now let's take a look at the dispute over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands between China and Japan when Japan was hit by similar economic retaliation from China.
Okay, well, when Japan was hit by Chinese retaliation, what Japan did was it diversified their exports. So they sent more of their exports to elsewhere. My recollection is that it still did end up hurting Japan overall, but not as much as they feared. And then after the political fighting was over, the retaliation was quietly withdrawn.
Now, what about Korea then? I mean, some are saying that it's time that Korea reduce its dependence on China. So what are some of the ways that Korea could come out of this stronger? Okay,
well, Korea may be able to reduce its dependence on China on the margins, so a few percent. But given that China, by purchasing power standards, so the real purchasing power standard is already the world's largest economy, and also they happen to be one of the two closest countries to Korea, I think we're always going to be very dependent on Chinese trade. Having said that, though, if we look at the relationship between China and the U.S., even though they have similar problems with U.S., they're forced to buy American goods because most of that is not available elsewhere. For example, CPUs for computers, the graphics chips for computers, they're not available elsewhere.
Okay.
So Korea really has to sort of upgrade its game. We've been saying this, that we need this for growth, we need this for here as well. If we make a lot of products which are not easily available elsewhere, then China will have no choice but to buy from Korea.
Now, China's two sessions of the National People's Congress and Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference kicked off last week, and expectations are that the meetings will address U.S. President Trump's protectionist moves. Now, is it possible that we might hear them address this issue over Seoul's deployment of THAAD?
Well, I think they will comment on Seoul's deployment. I'm not sure if they'll link trade to it, because right now it doesn't pay for them to tie the government, the trade issues and the defense issues. So they can just go on saying this is a problem with national sentiment, the NGOs, and they could still get the same effect without getting into a whole bunch of political fighting. So my expectation is that they'll still disapprove of THAAD deployment in Korea, and this type of indirect pressure, indirect retaliation through NGOs will probably continue until it's clear to China that they cannot change Korea's decision whether to deploy or employ the THAAD system.
All right, well, for now, we'll keep our eyes on those two sessions. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
The U.S. and China have toughened their import restrictions against Korean goods over the past year. According to Korea International Trade Association on Tuesday, the U.S. had imposed 23 import restrictions and China 13 as of the end of February. Now that's up a combined 16.1% from the 19 restrictions from the U.S. and 12 from China in the same month last year. Korea is currently subject to 181 restrictions in 30 countries in the form of anti-dumping duties, safeguards, and countervailing duties on steel, metal, and chemicals. While new investigations by all countries have declined overall, the number of restrictions by the U.S. and China are expected to go up due to U.S. President Donald Trump's America First policy agenda and chilled relations between Korea and China. Korean tech giant Samsung Electronics is expected to spend some $12.5 billion on its semiconductor facilities this year. According to the projection by market researcher IC Insights, the capital investment would represent an increase of 11% from the $11.3 billion spent in 2016. Although Samsung has yet to disclose its investment plans for this year, the figure would allow the firm to maintain the top spot in terms of capital spending on chip facilities. Intel came in second with $12 billion in capital spending, an increase of 25% from a year ago. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing landed in third place with $10 billion, and Korea's SK Hynix was fourth with $6 billion. Spain's economy is slowly getting back on track to recovery in the wake of the global financial crisis, with its growth rate outpacing that of major European nations. And with Korea also facing a slowing economy, our Kim Min-jae looks into what kind of lessons we can learn from the country.
Spain is slowly recovering from the throes of the global financial crisis, but Spaniards still have painful memories of that time.
You were walking the street and all the little shops here were closed and with a text saying to rent, but nobody was renting anything.
However, some problems in the wake of the crisis, such as high unemployment, still linger to this day.
It's still tough for young people, most with temporary jobs in the service sector, such as waiters or hotel workers, so life is still pretty hard for them.
At the same time, there's no doubt that the country is on the recovery track, especially with consumption and exports picking up, following government efforts to boost the economy, including fiscal and market reforms. As a result, Spain's growth has outpaced that of most of its EU counterparts, even though it's expected to weaken slightly in the coming months.
The Spanish economy is expected to grow in the mid-2% range this year, slowing from over 3% growth in 2016. While it still maintains recovery momentum, it faces a slowdown in job creation, rising consumer prices, and an array of external uncertainties.
Spain's unemployment rate stands at almost 19%, the second highest in the EU after Greece. Job growth has been slow and job quality poor. That, combined with high inflation, could take a toll on consumption going forward. Spain is also facing a raft of uncertainties from abroad, including Brexit, although the impact is yet to be seen, and the recovery in global oil prices. Like Spain, Korea is also heading into a cycle of low growth and is on track to post growth in the 2% range for a third straight year. However, experts say that while the economic structures of the two countries are different, there are things Korea can learn from the Spanish lesson.
Austerity by itself doesn't help economic growth. I'd say that Spain hasn't grown thanks to the austerity policies. It has grown in spite of them. It's also about creating quality jobs, because creating jobs might be a short-term solution, but the distributional issues and the equity issues that might be created might have very long-term effects.
Korea's troubles include political turmoil, possibly leading to an early presidential election, slowing consumption, and an ongoing corporate restructuring drive.
As long as you have a high household debt, consumption is not going to pick up very much. The Korean industry is undertaking a serious restructuring. With serious restructuring, you necessarily have frictions, and frictions mean low growth and unemployment.
The experts said patience will be the key as Korea confronts these issues, adding the support measures targeted at vulnerable groups, like those laid off from the restructuring program, will bring stronger positive results in the long term. Kim Min-ji, Business Daily, Barcelona.
And that wraps it up for today. Thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with more at the same time, same place for your Business Daily. Until then, goodbye.